Hello everybody and welcome back to another Destiny 2 video. Today we're going to be looking at some damage testing. In this video it's going to be mostly around the Supremacy, which is the sniper rifle from Last Wish. And most of what we're going to be doing is comparing the two different god rolls that this weapon has access to and deciding which one is better. We're going to have both testing of the sniper rifles alone as well as testing of different loadouts, since it's a special weapon and will probably not be your main damage output source. As always, there's timestamps down below that'll include both the tests of just the sniper as well as some different loadout tests in a hypothetical scenario. So without any delay, let's go ahead and get started. The main reason for these damage tests is because Supremacy has several new very strong rolls available on it after the updates to the Last Wish loot pool and Season of the Deep. It is currently unique among snipers in that it can get bait and switch, which will provide a 35% damage buff for hitting with all three of your weapons. Bait and switch has long been favorite on a lot of DPS weapons like Cataclysmic or more recently a couple of rocket launchers. And bait and switch is one of the strongest damage perks in the game based on numbers alone. And with rewind rounds, it should be a pretty clear winner, but here I want to compare the rewind bait and switch Supremacy to a rewind 4x the charm Supremacy. The main reason for that is because despite lacking any direct damage buffing perks, the 4x the charm roll actually has potential to be really broken, because most weapons in Destiny are limited in DPS output by their reload time and how often they need to reload. If you take longer to reload or have to reload more often, then your damage output drops to 0 for longer periods of time or more frequently during a damage phase. That's generally why perks like triple tap or 4th times increase your DPS despite not actually making you deal more damage per shot. Rewind rounds also performs a similar function, even though it pulls from reserves instead of making bullets out of thin air. It is still reducing the frequency of your reloads, and having both rewind and 4 times on the same roll will allow us to virtually never have to reload, while having rewind and bait and switch will give us both fewer reloads overall while providing a 35% damage buff. The two exact Supremacy rolls that we have here are as follows. We're going to use polygonal rifling for the barrel, but whatever barrel you want to use is fine, then appended mag for our magazine, rewind rounds, and then the only change is going to be the last column perk using either bait and switch or 4th times the charm. Both of these had stability masterworks, as a reload speed masterwork provided very little bonus when you had the intrinsic reload bonus on an empty mag for a 140 sniper. The first test was with bait and switch, where we were able to deal 559,258 total damage across the whole reserve, and our damage per second was 55,926 across the 10 seconds that bait and switch was active, and that dropped a little bit depending on what you chose for your bait and switch rotation. There is some dropped damage, unfortunately, during the time it takes to reload, since the bait and switch will still be active for your first reload, and will need to be reactivated mid-magazine on the second magazine to keep your damage as high as possible. A little more on this part later, but the quick answer is that you do have some options in order to try and keep your damage good, and the long answer is going to be a little more complex and will be covered in a later section of the video, where we will do some loadout comparisons to figure out what you should try with this. The rewind and 4th times roll, however, is one of the rare cases where a goofy weapon roll actually ends up being pretty good, and the main reason is because of the interaction between rewind rounds and 4th times the charm. Normally, rewind rounds will only give you 50% of the hits reloaded to your next magazine, and it rounds up. That's still technically the case here, but since 4th times the charm is causing your overall number of hits before reloading to be higher, you can essentially get full reloads whenever rewind rounds triggers. The best way I can explain this is that normally a 7-round magazine with rewind rounds should give you 4 shots back on the first activation, then 2 on the second, 1 on the third, and then you'll have to reload. With 4th times the charm, however, you're technically hitting 11 times before reloading, so the game gives you 6 shots back, and then you hit 10 times on the second go around, so the game gives you 5 back, and so on. But it keeps stacking up so that you'll actually never have to reload, since your 4th times the charm timer is never being reset by the time it takes to reload. So you'll end up getting a few activations of 4th times that you wouldn't be able to get otherwise right at the start of a magazine, where you may see it go from 5 on the rewind activation back to 7 on the 4th times activation. We were able to get ours to shoot 50 times in a row before having to reload, and because reloads weren't needed, it only took 21.5 seconds to fire all 50 of these shots. Each shot hits for 24,746, and your total reserve damage is 1,237,350. Your DPS is also very high for a special sniper at 57,658 despite not having any damage perk, and the other thing to think about is that that DPS is consistent. You never have to worry about it falling off to a reload. It's going to be that value the entire way through. Like I said earlier, the most harmful thing to your DPS output is going to be reloads, but here, because we've eliminated them entirely while having enough overall ammo to keep our total damage high, we've actually managed to get really high DPS and really high total damage without any damage boosting perk. A lot of weapons like this only roll with either a perk that can reduce how often you're going to reload, or a perk that can give you more bonus ammo. But Supremacy is the only one that's allowed to double dip here, besides probably Whisper of the Worm, which has to compete with better heavy weapons and so is not really in the meta at the moment. Before moving on, I just want to point out that in our last sniper rifle test video, just after the buffs to 140 snipers, the best performer was Cloudstrike at 1,216,322 total damage and 46,012 damage per second. Supremacy with rewind rounds and 4 times the charm has a higher total damage than Cloudstrike, and whether you go with 4 times the charm or bait and switch, both have higher damage per second than Cloudstrike while not occupying your exotic slot. This is compared to the best performing sniper in the last test. Just for reference, this is also competitive with a few linear fusions while not having to compete with them directly since it's in a different slot. So if you want to have a sniper on hand for when you're out of heavy ammo, Supremacy is definitely the best one you can get as a backup, and it's probably just the best 140 sniper in the game at the moment, period. But which of the two roles are actually better? Because I do think while it's pretty clear that Rewind and Fourth Times dominates both the DPS and the total damage categories in a vacuum, Supremacy being a special weapon, it isn't likely going to be your #1 main damage choice in damage phase. And I also think it's important to think about other weapons as well, because it's going to be paired with something, and Bait and Switch is going to need to hit with 3 weapons, which can make it a viable competitor if we can find a heavy weapon that's able to slot in and provide a good combo. Although its main drawback is that the perk is only really viable on a singular weapon in a loadout at a given time, since you have to wait for Bait and Switch to fall off before you can start to reactivate it. You won't really be able to double dip on its 10-second timer using 2 bait and switch weapons because the 10-second timers are going to run at the same time. On the other side of the coin, the Fourth Times role may not have a damage boosting perk, but it also is not going to be dependent on your other damage weapons and has very good total damage and damage per second as well. The downside here is that the Fourth Times role is going to have to wait its turn to get used, so it may be really good by itself, but if it doesn't fit into rotations very well, its damage is going to be reliant on longer term mag dumping. So let's pull up a couple of hypothetical scenarios for a second. Let's say that we have a longer range boss that's pretty easy to crit and has longer damage phases, but has a pretty steep DPS check. I think this is fair for both roles because an encounter like this would be really, really good for snipers, but would also need a good heavy weapon as well in order to pass that DPS check. The best example I can think of off the top of my head would be something like Day 1 War Priest for D2 King's Fall. For this example, let's look at a few potential loadouts to decide which role we'd want to have. We aren't going to assume that the players in this scenario have committed every single bit of their loadout to damage, because one of the weapons each player equips is going to be targeted towards dealing with adds, since most players will likely have something equipped for that purpose, whether it's a trace rifle or a primary weapon. I'm sure many players are very capable of equipping 2 sniper rifles in a linear fusion, and still keeping the adds under control, but we are just going to keep the loadouts simpler for this video, and we'll go down the line to find a clear winner loadout-wise, both for total damage, damage per second, and kind of looking at a comparison between the two. Damage values for these weapons are going to be pulled from previous testing videos where applicable, and I did double check these in the current sandbox. Lastly, we'll say that each damage phase is going to last about 30 seconds from start to finish, because that's usually the upper end of the length of damage phases, and we'll assume that all players are able to deal damage to the boss the entire time. Because we're using a 30-second example time, we'll just keep using our normal test dummy of Avarok the Covetous from Grasp of Avarice, since his damage phase is right at about 30 seconds. And the other thing is, again, this isn't necessarily supposed to be an example of a raid team composition, it's more supposed to compare potential damage outputs, and as always, our usual criteria of Well of Radiance and Divinity were used in the tests. Player 1 is going to optimize their damage loadout for total damage output. They're going to have a bait and switch 4th times Cataclysmic, a Supremacy with rewind 4th times, and their energy weapon is going to be for ad clear. Player 2 will use the same setup, but they're going to use a bait and switch rocket launcher instead of a bait and switch Cataclysmic. Their rocket is going to be Apex Predator with enhanced reconstruction and enhanced bait and switch. Player 3 is going to have an example of a bait and switch Supremacy loadout. Supremacy, energy weapon for adds, and then an Apex Predator with enhanced reconstruction and enhanced explosive light, since they can't double dip on bait and switch. Player 4 will be using a more supportive loadout, incorporating a bait and switch Supremacy. This player is going to be using Gjallarhorn to buff other rockets that his teammates may be using, but switching to a bait and switch Supremacy in between activations of Pack Hunter. We'll compare their damage to just using Gjallarhorn in a vacuum, since this player isn't really supposed to be topping the damage charts anyway. They just need to be able to do better damage than Gjallarhorn alone while keeping their team buffed. And then player 5 is going to be using the same type of loadout strategy as player 4, but with the rewind rounds and 4th times the charm roll of Supremacy instead of a bait and switch roll. And we're going to start with players 1 and 2 because they're going to basically be our control group. These players are not going to have any damage rotation going on. They will only switch to their snipers after using all of their ammo for their heavy, since their Supremacy rolls are specialized to being a backup weapon. Player 1's Cataclysmic can carry 32 shots in reserve when you factor in activations of 4 times the charm, and it has a total reserve damage of 2,253,221 and a DPS of 91,327 and you include reloads. If they find themselves out of heavy ammo, they can switch to their Supremacy for 1,237,300 total damage and 57,658 damage per second, and their full reserve of these two weapons is going to carry a combined 3,490,521 total damage output potential, but in our 30-second damage phase, they're not going to be able to fire all of that. And again, in 30 seconds, they should expect to run out of their Cataclysmic at around the 24-second mark, then fire their Supremacy for the remaining 6 seconds, which results in a 30-second total damage of approximately 2,599,170. This works out to about 85,306 damage per second across that entire duration, and if they were to fail to get much heavy ammo before the next phase, they'd still have their sniper rifle to fall back on, which should give just enough damage to get them across the finish line. For player 2, his rocket launcher will carry 7 rockets and the total reserve damage is 1,341,019 with Gjallarhorn buffing them. They should expect to run out of rockets at the 11-second mark of the damage phase and swap to Supremacy from there, which will net roughly 1,095,505 total damage for the remaining duration, and that makes the Loadout's total damage in a 30-second phase right at 2,436,524, and their DPS for this phase is 81,217 damage per second, which has both of these players dealing pretty good damage across the entire phase, pretty close to each other, but the Cataclysmic roll does win out just a little bit, as is expected from a linear fusion. Player 3 is where we're going to have an example of a bait and switch rotation. His rocket launcher will have 7 shots and a total reserve damage of 1,138,158 damage. They're going to expect to run out of bait and switch after 10 seconds, but over the course of the damage phase, they will get a total of 1,664,159 damage, which equates to roughly 55,472 damage per second, and this is including times they have to reactivate their bait and switch on the sniper rifle. When they run out of sniper ammo, they'll just dump whatever leftover rockets they have with any time they have remaining in the damage phase, and the DPS is similar to the bait and switch Supremacy here, but the total damage is a good bit higher, so it does fix the issue of the bait and switch Supremacy having much lower total damage output. However, it is still significantly weaker than just mag dumping with your heavy and then switching to a rewind 4th time Supremacy. So trying to use a bait and switch Supremacy in order to get good damage is not really competitive with using the rewind 4th times as a backup and just using your heavy weapon like normal. But what if you're using Gjallarhorn to buff your teammates? Well, for that we have player 4's loadout, where they're going to fire their Gjallarhorn, activate bait and switch on Supremacy, then deal damage with their Supremacy until bait and switch runs out, and then use Gjallarhorn again in order to keep Pack Hunter active on their teammates, while also getting them a bit of more efficient damage, since Gjallarhorn's damage alone is relatively weak for a heavy weapon, but once they run out of sniper ammo, they can all still dump Gjallarhorn with any remaining time, and a lot of the damage potential of Gjallarhorn is coming from keeping your teammates with better rocket launchers buffed. In our 30-second damage phase, player 4 was able to get a total damage output of 1,253,230, which is around 41,774 damage per second. This is a little lower than Gjallarhorn's damage per second by itself. However, Gjallarhorn runs out of ammo pretty quickly if you just mag dump it anyway, and the total resulting damage after switching to your sniper when you run out of heavy came out to 1,244,288 or 41,476 DPS, which is basically the same, and either way you run it, it is pretty similar. So I would actually recommend just using Gjallarhorn intermittently and then switching to your sniper rifle to just keep your damage as efficient as possible here, because you're basically getting the same output either way. Player 5's strategy is to do the same exact thing, dealing most of their damage with their sniper rifle, then switching to Gjallarhorn to keep Pack Hunter up for their teammates. In a 30-second damage phase, they were able to do 1,262,855 total damage, or 42,095 damage per second, and even here, 4 times the charm with rewind rounds is better for longer damage phases, but the difference is pretty small, so if you prefer bait and switch, that's not a bad idea either. However, I would recommend just using this with Gjallarhorn, and then switching to Gjallarhorn every 10 or 12 seconds to keep the Pack Hunter buff active on your teammates. 4 times the charm is still definitely better here for longer damage phases, but the difference is kind of small, so if bait and switch is preferred, then it's not a terrible idea either. But out of all of these, with the scenario we laid out earlier, it is pretty clear that a loadout like player 1's is likely the best for any crit-based boss, which is really where you are going to be using a sniper as a backup DPS option anyway. It uses a 140 sniper rifle in its really best role in the current sandbox, which is a backup weapon that you can rely on if you don't have any more heavy ammo. Bait and switch is really good, but it's best used on heavy weapons where the 35% damage buff is stronger than trying to force it to make a special ammo sniper replace your heavy weapon. Factor that in with the really crazy damage output of the rewind rounds 4 times the charm roll, and I think you can't go wrong with Supremacy using that roll over the bait and switch version. However, that is all I have for today's video, so thank you so much for watching. Remember to like, share, and sub if you want to continue supporting the channel. Follow my Twitch linked below if you want to see some streams, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Later, everybody.